Section 27 of The Common Reader. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. The Common Reader by Virginia Woolf. How it strikes a contemporary. In the first place, a contemporary can scarcely fail to be struck by the fact that two critics at the same table, at the same moment, will pronounce completely different opinions about the same book. Here, on the right, it is declared a masterpiece of English prose. On the left, simultaneously, a mere mass of waste paper, which, if the fire could survive it, should be thrown upon the flames. Yet, both critics are in agreement about Milton and about Keats. They display an exquisite sensibility, and have undoubtedly a genuine enthusiasm. It is only when they discuss the work of contemporary writers that they inevitably come to blows. The book in question, which is at once a lasting contribution to English literature and a mere farrago of pretentious mediocrity, was published about 2 months ago. That is the explanation. That is why they differ. The explanation is a strange one. It is equally disconcerting to the reader who wishes to take his bearings in the chaos of contemporary literature, and to the writer who has a natural desire to know whether his own work, produced with infinite pains, and in almost utter darkness, is likely to burn forever among the fixed luminaries of English letters, or, on the contrary, to put out the fire. But if we identify ourselves with the reader, and explore his dilemma first, our bewilderment is short-lived enough. The same thing has happened so often before. We have heard the doctors disagreeing about the new, and agreeing about the old twice a year on the average, in spring and autumn, ever since Robert Elsmere, or was it Stephen Phillips, somehow pervaded the atmosphere, and there was the same disagreement among grown-up people about them. It would be much more marvelous, and indeed much more upsetting, if, for a wonder, both gentlemen agreed, pronounced Blank's book an undoubted masterpiece, and thus faced us with the necessity of deciding whether we should back their judgment to the extent of 10 and 6 pence. Both are critics of reputation. The opinions tumbled out so spontaneously here will be starched and stiffened into columns of sober prose, which will uphold the dignity of letters in England and America. It must be some innate cynicism, then, some ungenerous distrust of contemporary genius, which determines us automatically, as the talk goes on that, were they to agree, which they show no signs of doing, half a guinea is altogether too large a sum to squander upon contemporary enthusiasms, and the case will be met quite adequately by a card to the library. Still the question remains, and let us put it boldly to the critics themselves. Is there no guidance nowadays for a reader who yields to none in reverence for the dead, but is tormented by the suspicion that reverence for the dead is vitally connected with understanding of the living? After a rapid survey, both critics are agreed that there is unfortunately no such person. For what is their own judgment worth where new books are concerned? Certainly not 10 and 6 pence. And from the stores of their experience, they proceed to bring forth terrible examples of past blunders, crimes of criticism which, if they had been committed against the dead and not against the living, would have lost them their jobs and imperiled their reputations. The only advice they can offer is to respect one's own instincts, to follow them fearlessly, and, rather than submit them to the control of any critic or reviewer alive, to check them by reading and reading again the masterpieces of the past. Thanking them humbly, we cannot help reflecting that it was not always so. Once upon a time, we must believe, there was a rule, a discipline, which controlled the great republic of readers in a way which is now unknown. That is not to say that the great critic, the Dryden, the Johnson, the Coleridge, the Arnold, was an impeccable judge of contemporary work, whose verdict stamped the book indelibly, and saved the reader the trouble of reckoning the value for himself. The mistakes of those great men about their own contemporaries are too notorious to be worth recording, but the mere fact of their existence had a centralizing influence. That alone, it is not fantastic to suppose, would have controlled the disagreements of the dinner table, and given to random chatter about some book just out in authority now entirely to seek. The diverse schools would have debated as hotly as ever, but at the back of every reader's mind would have been the consciousness that there was at least one man who kept the main principles of literature closely in view, who, if you had taken to him some eccentricity of the moment, would have brought it into touch with permanence, and tethered it by his own authority in the contrary blasts of praise and blame. Footnote 15. How violent these are 2 quotations will show. It, told by an idiot. should be read as The Tempest should be read, and as Gulliver's Travels should be read. For if Miss Macauley's poetic gift happens to be less sublime than those of the author of The Tempest, and if her irony happens to be less tremendous than that of the author of Gulliver's Travels, her justice and wisdom are no less noble than theirs. The Daily News. The next day we read, "For the rest, one can only say that if Mr. Eliot had been pleased to write in demotic English, the wasteland might not have been, as it just is to all but anthropologists and literati, so much waste paper." The Manchester Guardian. And footnote 15. But when it comes to the making of a critic, nature must be generous and society ripe. The scattered dinner tables of the modern world, the chase and eddy of the various currents which compose the society of our time, could only be dominated by a giant of fabulous dimensions. And where is even the very tall man whom we have the right to expect? Reviewers we have, but no critic. A million competent and incorruptible policemen, but no judge. Men of taste and learning and ability are forever lecturing the young and celebrating the dead. But the too frequent result of their able and industrious pens is a desiccation of the living tissues of literature into a network of little bones. Nowhere shall we find the downright vigor of a Dryden, or Keats with his fine and natural bearing, his profound insight and sanity, or Flaubert and the tremendous power of his fanaticism, or Coleridge, above all, brewing in his head the whole of poetry, and letting issue now and then one of those profound general statements which are caught up by the mind, when hot with the friction of reading, as if they were the soul of the book itself. And to all this, too, the critics generously agree. A great critic, they say, is the rarest of beings. But should one miraculously appear, how should we maintain him? On what should we feed him? Great critics, if they are not themselves great poets, are bred from the profusion of the age. There is some great man to be vindicated, some school to be founded or destroyed. But our age is meager to the verge of destitution. There is no name which dominates the rest. There is no master in whose workshop the young are proud to serve apprenticeship. Mr. Hardy has long since withdrawn from the arena, and there is something exotic about the genius of Mr. Conrad, which makes him not so much an influence as an idol, honored and admired, but aloof and apart. As for the rest, though they are many and vigorous and in the full flood of creative activity, there is none whose influence can seriously affect his contemporaries, or penetrate beyond our day to that not very distant future which it pleases us to call immortality. If we make a century our test, and ask how much of the work produced in these days in England will be in existence then, we shall have to answer not merely that we cannot agree upon the same book, but that we are more than doubtful whether such a book there is. It is an age of fragments, a few stanzas, a few pages, a chapter here and there. The beginning of this novel, the end of that, are equal to the best of any age or author. But can we go to posterity with a sheaf of loose pages, or ask the readers of those days, with the whole of literature before them, to sift our enormous rubbish heaps for our tiny pearls? Such are the questions which the critics might lawfully put to their companions at table, the novelists and poets. At first, the weight of pessimism seems sufficient to bear down all opposition. Yes, it is a lean age, we repeat, with much to justify its poverty. But, frankly, if we pit one century against another, the comparison seems overwhelmingly against us. Waverley, The Excursion, Kubla Khan, Don Juan, Hazlitt's Essays, Pride and Prejudice, Hyperion, and Prometheus Unbound were all published between 1800 and 1821. Our century has not lacked industry. But if we ask for masterpieces, it appears on the face of it that the pessimists are right. It seems as if an age of genius must be succeeded by an age of endeavor, riot and extravagance by cleanliness and hard work. All honor, of course, to those who have sacrificed their immortality to set the house in order. But if we ask for masterpieces, where are we to look? A little poetry, we may feel sure, will survive. A few poems by Mr. Yeats, by Mr. Davies, by Mr. de la Mare. Mr. Lawrence, of course, has moments of greatness, but hours of something very different. Mr. Beerbohm, in his way, is perfect, but it is not a big way. Passages in Far Away and Long Ago will undoubtedly go to posterity entire. Ulysses was a memorable catastrophe, immense in daring, terrific in disaster. And so, picking and choosing, we select now this, now that, hold it up for display, hear it defended or derided, and finally have to meet the objection that even so, we are only agreeing with the critics that it is an age incapable of sustained effort, littered with fragments, and not seriously to be compared with the age that went before. But it is just when opinions universally prevail, and we have added lip service to their authority, that we become sometimes most keenly conscious that we do not believe a word that we are saying. It is a barren and exhausted age, we repeat. We must look back with envy to the past. Meanwhile, it is one of the first fine days of spring. Life is not altogether lacking in color. The telephone, which interrupts the most serious conversations and cuts short the most weighty observations, has a romance of its own. And the random talk of people who have no chance of immortality, and thus can speak their minds out, has a setting, often, of lights, streets, houses, human beings, beautiful or grotesque, which will weave itself into the moment forever. But this is life. The talk is about literature. We must try to disentangle the two, and justify the rash revolt of optimism against the superior plausibility, the finer distinction of pessimism. Our optimism, then, is largely instinctive. It springs from the fine day, and the wine, and the talk. It springs from the fact that when life throws up such treasures daily suggests more than the most voluble can express. Much though we admire the dead, we prefer life as it is. There is something about the present which we would not exchange, though we were offered a choice of all past ages to live in. And modern literature, with all its imperfections, has the same hold on us and the same fascination. It is like a relation whom we snub and scarify daily, but after all, cannot do without. It has the same endearing quality of being that which we are, that which we have made, that in which we live, instead of being something, however august, alien to ourselves and beheld from the outside. Nor has any generation more need than ours to cherish its contemporaries. We are sharply cut off from our predecessors. A shift in the scale, the war, the sudden slip of masses held in position for ages, has shaken the fabric from top to bottom, alienated us from the past, and made us perhaps too vividly conscious of the present. Every day we find ourselves doing, saying, or thinking things that would have been impossible to our fathers, and we feel the differences which have not been noted far more keenly than the resemblances which have been very perfectly expressed. New books lure us to read them partly in the hope that they will reflect this rearrangement of our attitude, these scenes, thoughts, and apparently fortuitous groupings of incongruous things which impinge upon us with so keen a sense of novelty, and, as literature does, give it back into our keeping, whole and comprehended. Here, indeed, there is every reason for optimism. No age can have been more rich than ours in writers determined to give expression to the differences which separate them from the past, and not to the resemblances which connect them with it. It would be invidious to mention names, but the most casual reader dipping into poetry, into fiction, into biography, can hardly fail to be impressed by the courage, the sincerity, in a word, by the widespread originality of our time. But our exhilaration is strangely curtailed. Book after book leaves us with the same sense of promise unachieved, of intellectual poverty, of brilliance which has been snatched from life, but not transmuted into literature. Much of what is best in contemporary work has the appearance of being noted under pressure, taken down in a bleak shorthand, which preserves with astonishing brilliance the movements and expressions of the figures as they pass across the screen. But the flash is soon over, and there remains with us a profound dissatisfaction. The irritation is as acute as the pleasure was intense. After all, then, we are back at the beginning, vacillating from extreme to extreme, at one moment enthusiastic, at the next pessimistic, unable to come to any conclusion about our contemporaries. We have asked the critics to help us, but they have deprecated the task. Now, then, is the time to accept their advice and correct these extremes by consulting the masterpieces of the past. We feel ourselves indeed driven to them, impelled not by calm judgment, but by some imperious need to anchor our instability upon their security. But, honestly, the shock of the comparison between past and present is at first disconcerting. Undoubtedly, there is a dullness in great books. There is an unabashed tranquility in page after page of Wordsworth and Scott and Miss Austen, which is sedative to the verge of somnolence. Opportunities occur, and they neglect them. Shades and subtleties accumulate, and they ignore them. They seem deliberately to refuse to gratify those senses which are stimulated so briskly by the moderns, the senses of sight, of sound, of touch, above all, the the sense of the human being, his depth and the variety of his perceptions, his complexity, his confusion, his self, in short. There is little of all this in the works of Wordsworth and Scott and Jane Austen. From what, then, arises that sense of security, which gradually, delightfully, and completely overcomes us? It is the power of their belief, their conviction, that imposes itself upon us. In Wordsworth, the philosophic poet, this is obvious enough, but it is equally true of the careless Scot, who scribbled masterpieces to build castles before breakfast, and of the modest maiden lady, who wrote furtively and quietly simply to give pleasure. In both, there is the same natural conviction that life is of a certain quality. They have their judgment of conduct. They know the relations of human beings towards each other and towards the universe. Neither of them probably has a word to say about the matter outright, but everything depends on it. Only believe, we find ourselves saying, and all the rest will come of itself. Only believe, to take a very simple instance which the recent publication of the Watsons brings to mind, that a nice girl will instinctively try to soothe the feelings of a boy who has been snubbed at a dance, and then, if you believe it implicitly and unquestioningly, you will not only make people 100 years later feel the same thing, but you will make them feel it as literature. For certainty of that kind is the condition which makes it possible to write. To believe that your impressions hold good for others is to be released from the cramp and confinement of personality. It is to be free, as Scott was free, to explore with a vigor which still holds us spellbound the whole world of adventure and romance. It is also the first step in that mysterious process in which Jane Austen was so great an adept. The little grain of experience once selected, believed in, and set outside herself, could be put precisely in its place, and she was then free to make of it, by a process which never yields its secrets to the analyst, and to that complete statement which is literature. So then our contemporaries afflict us because they have ceased to believe. The most sincere of them will only tell us what it is that happens to himself. They cannot make a world, because they are not free of other human beings. They cannot tell stories, because they do not believe the stories are true. They cannot generalize. They depend on their senses and emotions, whose testimony is trustworthy, rather than on their intellects, whose message is obscure. And they have perforce to deny themselves the use of some of the most powerful and some of the most exquisite of the weapons of their craft. With the whole wealth of the English language at the back of them, they timidly pass about from hand to hand and book to book only the meanest copper coins. Set down at a fresh angle of the eternal prospect, they can only whip out their notebooks and record with agonized intensity the flying gleams, which light on what? And the transitory splendors, which may, perhaps, compose nothing whatever. But here the critics interpose, and with some show of justice. If this description holds good, they say, and is not, as it may well be, entirely dependent upon our position at the table, and certain purely personal relationships to mustard pots and flower vases, then the risks of judging contemporary work are greater than ever before. There is every excuse for them, if they are wide of the mark, and no doubt it would be better to retreat, as Matthew Arnold advised, from the burning ground of the present to the safe tranquility of the past. We enter on burning ground, wrote Matthew Arnold, as we approach the poetry of times so near to us, poetry like that of Byron, Shelley, and Wordsworth, of which the estimates are so often not only personal, but personal with passion. And this, they remind us, was written in the year 1880. Beware, they say, of putting under the microscope 1 inch of a ribbon, which runs many miles. Things sort themselves out if you wait. Moderation and a study of the classics are to be recommended. Moreover, life is short, the Byron centenary is at hand, and the burning question of the moment is, did he, or did he not, marry his sister? To sum up then, if indeed any conclusion is possible when everybody is talking at once, and it is time to be going, it seems that it would be wise for the writers of the present to renounce for themselves the hope of creating masterpieces. Their poems, plays, biographies, novels are not books but notebooks, and time, like a good schoolmaster, will take them in his hands, point to their blots and narrations, and tear them across, but he will not throw them into the waste-paper basket. He will keep them because other students will find them very useful. It is from notebooks of the present that the masterpieces of the future are made. Literature, as the critics were saying just now, has lasted long, has undergone many changes, and it is only a short sight and a parochial mind that will exaggerate the importance of these squalls, However, they may agitate the little boats now tossing out at sea. The storm and the drenching are on the surface, and continuity and calm are in the depths. As for the critics whose task it is to pass judgment upon the books of the moment, whose work, let us admit, is difficult, dangerous, and often distasteful, let us ask them to be generous of encouragement, but sparing of those wreaths and coronets which are so apt to get awry and fade and make the wearers, in 6 months' time, look a little ridiculous. Let them take a wider, a less personal view of modern literature, and look indeed upon the writers as if they were engaged upon some vast building, which being built by common effort, the separate workmen may well remain anonymous. Let them slam the door upon the cozy company where sugar is cheap and butter plentiful. Give over, for a time at least, the discussion of that fascinating topic, whether Byron married his sister, and withdrawing, perhaps, a hand's breadth from the table where we sit chattering, say something interesting about literature. Let us buttonhole them as they leave, and recall to their memory that gaunt aristocrat, Lady Hester Stanhope, who kept the milk-white horse in her stable in readiness for the Messiah, and was forever scanning the mountain-tops, impatiently but with confidence, for signs of his approach, and asked them to follow her example. Scan the horizon, see the past in relation to the future, and so prepare the way for masterpieces to come. End of section 27. Read by Arden. July 28. End of The Common Reader by Virginia Woolf.